What I just done read.
Oh! Who is this that is coming? Yeah, that's kind of a clue, but then again, if you've seen the thumbnail, then you wouldn't have needed it. Hello, and welcome back to What I Just Done Read. This is my Bohemian Book Corner, and this is a book review show that attempts to give a fair airing to books of all ages, not just those currently gracing either the bestsellers or the new releases lists. As it turns out, today's book is a reasonably recent release, coming out towards the end of last year, and it is Eerie, East Anglia, Fearful Tales of Field and Fen, edited and compiled by Edward Parnell. Before we come on to that, first of all, I just want to say, as always, thank you to everybody who's been checking out the channel recently. Your support and love is more than appreciated, so thank you. And, of course, if you do enjoy what we do here, please do all the usual. Please do like, share, subscribe, and, more importantly, tell your friends. Go on, then. I do apologise as well, as you may be able to hear. I'm still in the death throes of the illness that I had a couple of weeks ago, so I do apologise for any you might get from me in this episode. Before we look at the book and before we look at our bullet point biography, we would normally have the business of our word of the day. Because this book is a bit more pertinent for myself, as it's to do with stories set in the East Anglia region, and as I am very much in the heartland of East Anglia here in Norwich. Rather than doing my usual sort of word of the day, I had a bit of a trawl online, and thanks to one of the local newspapers, if you just let me whip this out here.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
I found a list of interesting Norfolk proverbs. Norfolk has something of a reputation of being the epitome of civilization. But I found these that I thought were quite interesting, that kind of illustrate that there may be a little bit more going on upstairs in the average Norfolk person than most of you in the outer regions of the UK may have previously suspected. I'm not going to go through the whole lot. There's just about 3 of them that I picked that I kind of quite liked, that I thought were quite interesting and insightful. The first proverb, again, I don't have any dates for when these date from or what parts of the region, but that's not important as the things themselves. The proverb itself is, "The dog that fetches also carries." The meaning of which is that someone who tells you gossip will also be telling gossip about you to others. So just be a bit more careful, okay? The next one is, "He got the fiddle but not the stick." Basically means you may have all of the books or all of the accoutrements that you have to be able to do something, but you're simply not clever enough to know how to use them properly. And the last one, which is easily the most pertinent to the subject matter we're looking at with today's book, "A ground sweat cures all disorders." The meaning of which is simply, you don't suffer when you're dead and buried. There. So, and there's a few more of these. If I can find it, I'll put a link to the article. I think it was from the EDP, from the Eastern Daily Press. I'll put a link to it in the description below so you can see some of the others as well. There was about 20 of them in total. So, let's get rid of that. Today's book. As I say, this is a anthology collection of ghost stories set in and around the East Anglian area. If you don't know what area that covers, that's basically Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, and arguably parts of South Lincolnshire as well. But that's the main kind of 4 counties that comprised East Anglia. That's more for our international viewers. As I say, this one came out last year, so pretty recent release. I was lucky enough actually to meet Mr. Parnell when he gave a talk about the book here in Norwich in October, as can be evidenced. See? In case you didn't believe me, why wouldn't you? And in addition to meeting him last year, for this review, I've had the opportunity to contact him via email and have a bit of an exchange with him about some of the ideas and themes that went into his selection for this. Most of that I'll come on to a bit later, but it did give us a chance to get some details from him for my bullet point biography. So I am just going to read this out here, and obviously it'll be on screen for you as well, so you can read it at your own leisure. Edward Parnell has recently moved to just outside Edinburgh, having previously grown up and lived predominantly in East Anglia. His first novel, The Listeners, published in 2014, which won the Rethink New Novels Prize, was a gothic tale of family secrets set in West Norfolk in 1940. Ghostland, In Search of a Haunted Country, Williams Collin, published in 2019, a work of narrative non-fiction, is an elegiac meditation on grief and memory and on the redemptive power of stories and nature. It was shortlisted for the 2020 PEN Ackley Prize, and he also edited today's book, which was published by British Library Publishing last year. Edward is the literary director of the Victor Wynd Museum of Curiosities and also teaches creative non-fiction for the National Centre for Writing. More information about his work can be found at his website, and again, check the description for a link to that. So I believe this is the most recent of this series of anthologies that's been produced by the British Library under British Library Publishing. I believe the series is called, here we go, Tales of the Weird. And I must admit, I hadn't realised how many of these anthology collections have been released. Today, my good friend Jonathan Took has at least a dozen on his shelf, which I didn't realise there was that many of them. And I thought that was really nice. As a member of the British Library myself, I was of course, I'm quite excited and quite cheered to see that they're taking such a proactive measures to bring these kind of works to a new reading audience, which is fantastic. So, tick VG. The volume itself comprises 17 stories set in and around the East Anglia area and covers approximately 116 years worth of creative endeavour, shall we say. The earliest of the stories, coming from 1904, being arguably one of the greatest Edwardian ghost stories ever written, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, by M.R. James.
Oh no. Oh no.
All the way up to Blood Rights by Daisy Johnson, which is from like 2018, I want to say. I think it's as recent as that. 2016, excuse me. Also then bookended with M.R. James's final ghost story, A Vignette. What I loved about this is that the stories themselves, Edward has presented them in chronological order. They even go to the point of including the year of release for each of the stories. Let me just give you an example. Yeah, so they've included what year the stories were released on the introduction page to each of them, which is really nice. And for me personally, I really liked about that is they make a feature of something that was very much coincidental, if you like, in another anthology series, which was the Handbooks of Horror, which I've been collecting. Those were released once every year over a period of 30 years. So again, you get to see those shifts and changes in style and subject matter of what was popular in the horror genres over that period of time. It's kind of like a microversal version of that in this book, which is really nice. So again, tick VG. Each of the stories comes with a short introduction, more of a biography of the relevant author, which again was quite insightful and quite it was quite an opener for me. There's a few of the authors in here that had more of a connection to each other than even I knew, which was kind of quite nice. So again, thank you very much for that. I mean, in terms of again, so looking a bit more at the product itself. Obviously, the cover art. I like this one because it evokes something like almost like a woodcut, which is really nice. But I think, yes, because of the monkey. This is from the story Stivinghoe Bank. But there is a couple of instances of some nice artwork in here. So that from Death's Farm, and quite a famous image, which is from Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, on the back there, which are all really nice, and they all serve to evoke the candlelight setting by which you should read any good Gothic horror. And as any aficionado of the genre will tell you, when it comes to the Gothic, aesthetic is king. When I was first looking at this, I mean, I did think that, it would have been nicer if they'd have included a few more sort of illustrations to accompany the stories. But then again, at the same time, I was like, actually, while they would have been nice, they are an extra flourish, and maybe if they'd have included more of them, that might have overshadowed the actual meat of the volume, namely the stories themselves. Curiously enough, one of the things that I did notice with this, and it seems to be, certainly it's a Norfolk thing, I don't know whether about generally an at least Anglian thing, that most of the authors who've written about the area are not from the area. And again, that is a very Norfolk thing that, you know, the most popular people or the most recognised people who have any connection to this place are not from here. I mean, even M.R. James himself, yes, he spent most of his childhood here, but he's originally from Kent. Another perfect example would be Sir Thomas Browne, whose statue still graces the Haymarket in Norwich, who originally was from Oxfordshire. And I thought that was quite interesting, and I did have a chance to ask Edward a few sort of questions about some of this, and I'll come on to that a bit more in my kind of thoughts and recommendations section of this in a bit. While there are a lot of writers whose names I recognise, there's also a lot that I don't, and I think that's really nice. And again, for anybody, regardless of what level of appreciation you have for the fantastical, there will be people in here that you've never heard of, which is really nice. Any opportunity to discover new writers who you may then choose to research more is fantastic. And Edward has made a concerted effort to find a nice balance between male and female authors. I must admit, from reading a lot of the other anthologies that I've read before, there's quite a few of these names that I don't know, and the works that they've shown here are people that I'm going to go, actually, these are really, really good. I'm going to do a bit more of a deep dive into some of their work. But again, I'll touch on a few of those examples a bit later in my review. Final kind of notes before I go and do the eye thing. On the product itself, as I said, I do really like it. A couple of down things I would say about this, because clearly the book hasn't been lacquered or given any kind of protection. While that is quite nice, it does mean, as you can possibly see, there's already some fading here, some wear and tear, and again, this book is barely 6 months old. So I think when we come to our eye ratings, that might lose it an eye or two when it comes to the longevity of the physical product. That's a bit of a worry. Got a few more things to say, and again, as I say, I do have the responses that I got back from Edward to my questions to him, which I'll also dive into next. But before I do that, I am going to run off and stick some eyes in a book, as I am wont to do. So while I do so, I shall leave you with a warning from my assistant, who is not in a glittery swimsuit, Mr. William Ager.
Oh, Dickens!
Xadrum is more than just curious content on YouTube. We're also a small publishing house, with books covering a range of genres from 1940s pulp adventure to children's novels, and even a touch of the macabre for those who like their literature on the dark side. Our titles are available in both paperback and ebook formats. Ebooks are available on Amazon, but physical copies can only be bought exclusively through our website at xadrum.com. Jeff's got enough cash as it is, so why not help us little guys grow and thrive? Links can be found in our banner and in the description to all of our videos, and we look forward to helping you indulge your itch for escapism. Okay, and we're back, and eyes are in here. We'll come to those in a moment. Oh, nom 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 nom. Sorry, I like my tea. What can I say? Yes, so there's a few things that I kind of mulled over about this, and as I say, I'm kind of lucky in this respect that I was able to contact Edward directly and ask him about them. So again, thank you for taking the time to respond to us. It makes a lot of difference for these, and also, again, rather than having to work on my own surmises to get things straight from the horse's mouth. Not that horse. It was quite nice. One of the things I did notice, predominantly through the introductions to each of the stories and these mini biographies for each of the authors, was that a lot of the stories, especially those from the early parts of the 20th century, all of the authors that he's picked seem to have had some direct or, at the very least, tangential connection to M.R. James himself. And so I did ask him about this, because when I was first reading it, it sort of felt a bit like oversaturation. I don't know whether that was simply hero worship or what. Because it seemed to narrow down the field, or the scope, if you like, of horror stories set in this area. that they all have some direct connection to M.R. James as the greatest exponent of work set in East Anglia. For example, the story called The Man with the Roller, which is essentially an imitation of James's story, The Mezzotint. And then you find out that the author knew James, and things like this. And I was just like, okay. So I did ask him about this. I just basically said, was it a conscious decision to select stories from authors that had such a direct connection to the great man himself? And he responded by saying that his primary criteria was for stories set in East Anglia, which I took to mean Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Cambridgeshire, regardless of where the author came from. I obviously wanted the strongest possible stories, albeit with a few caveats that I had to negotiate. I didn't want to feature more than one story from a single writer, although he did break the rule with regards to M.R. James, and again, I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. And I wanted to have a spread of stories in terms of the period from when they were written, subject matter, etc. When I began seriously thinking about my long list of stories, I already knew of many of the obvious authors to look at, as I was aware of the East Anglian setting of some of their works. But as I gradually whittled down my list, it became apparent how many of the writers had a connection with Cambridge University, and often with James himself. I knew of several of the obvious connections, but the extent of the Cambridge connection was something of a surprise. So that's interesting. I did find that interesting that it wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened to be pure serendipity that, actually, these people are all interconnected. And then, obviously, having read that and then sort of thinking about it a bit more, I must admit, it's actually quite nice. Not so much because it shows any kind of limitation in scope, as I said previously. More that it shows the breadth and the depth of the scope and of the impact that M.R. James had on ghost story writing. Not just set in this region, but overall. That so many people would cite him as an influence. Even those who have written stories that appear in this collection who wouldn't have been alive during James's lifetime. Many of them apparently will still cite James, and even myself from the work that I have produced. I would say that in some small part there is a nod to James in there. Seeing the scope of his influence in practice, as it were, in the way that it appears in the volume, was actually really nice. So, again, great find, Edward, thank you. And that really kind of... Again, I think knowing, again, that it was purely coincidental, that it wasn't something that he'd set out consciously to do, does sort of recontextualise how you absorb that information. Again, I did ask him as well about the fact that so many of these writers are not from this area. I think about one of the few that is Daisy Johnson, who's the most recent writer. Certainly when you look at some of the older works, was it because there just isn't that many extant works from native writers, shall we say? To which again he's responded, I wasn't too worried about where the writers came from. It was the setting of the stories themselves that needed the local connection. There were writers of Eerie tales who had strong associations with the region. For example, L.P. Hartley, Lucy Boston, who, as far as I can tell, didn't write any stories explicitly set in the region, or at least in which the region plays a reasonable role. This was a disappointment, but added to part of the challenge of finding potentially suitable stories. Despite East Anglia featuring predominantly in many well-known stories from M.R. James and the Benson brothers, there really weren't as many other tales set in the region as you might have expected. And again, I must admit, that was one of the things that did surprise me. I'm a big fan of E.F. Benson. I didn't realise that E.F. Benson is the youngest of 6 brothers. 6? Is it the 6 or 4? I can't remember. Most of whom were writers. And so one of his brothers, R.H. Benson, has a story that features in this volume as well. I did also go on to ask, because again, as I mentioned earlier, that there is at least a dozen or so volumes in the Tales of the Weird collection. And the last couple of questions that I had to ask him were about specific choices of certain stories. As a result of which it did make me think, were his choices limited by the fact that stories may have appeared in other volumes in the series? So I did ask him this, and again, to which he responded, he didn't think that there was much competition as such, but as more anthologies come out, it is getting harder to avoid previously included titles. He says he really wanted to include The Badlands by John Metcalfe, for instance, but that had featured in the Roads of Destiny volume in 2023, which he said was a shame, as he thinks it's one of the most striking Norfolk set tales. So it's good to see that the guys who are editing these do have reasonably free rein over the stories, and also that there is a wealth of stories to choose from to include in the series itself. As I mentioned, there was 2 of the stories that I did ask him about, specifically why he chose those ones. The first one is ironically enough, the story by E.F. Benson that appears in this volume called The Dust Cloud. Benson also wrote another story set in Norfolk called A Tale of an Empty House. The empty house in that story is a real place. It still exists today. It is a solitary building in the wilds of Norfolk, not far from Blakeney. It has no mod cons, it has no electricity, no laid-on water, and you can stay there. Apparently every year the people who own it, they do like an auction, and you can bid on it for an opportunity to go and spend a week or a weekend there. Go and rough it properly. I was curious as to why he hadn't included that story instead of the one from Benson that he did. So in his response to this, and it's curious because it does in places slightly contradict what I was just saying, but I can understand why. He does say another issue that I had to deal with as an editor was trying not to duplicate tales that had already featured in other Tales from the Weird volumes. I did include Marjorie Bowen's The Crown Derby Plate, as it's one of my favourite stories, and I wanted to include more stories by women. Again, although there are a lot of female short story writers working in the genre, there appeared to me to be a dearth of tales of them that's written set in East Anglia. So I managed to smuggle that one in, as the anthology it had previously featured in was several years old. And that's why I opted for The Dust Cloud, as that hadn't featured before in a British Library title. Whereas A Tale of an Empty House, one of my favourites by E.F. Benson, has. It slightly undermines what I just said, but again I can understand why, and at least it does prove that I was kind of correct in that there is a question there of juggling titles to make sure you get the ones that you want. The other one that I did ask him about, and I did actually ask him briefly when I met him in October, unfortunately, you're in a queue waiting for somebody to sign a book so we couldn't have a proper conversation about it, was his choice of the opening story, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And I must admit, it's one of the ones that I still, and even having had a response from him, I still struggle with this particular choice. The reason being is simply this. Again, as I said at the start, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad is arguably one of the greatest Edwardian ghost stories ever written. And I can understand why you'd want to open a volume on Norfolk or East Anglian based ghost stories with that. Of all of the stories that you could open it with, that's the one that, shall we say, normies will most likely recognise. But the problem is that I have with that is that I don't think it is the best example of James's work set in this region. When you take away the long, lonely, forlorn, windswept sandy beaches of Norfolk that feature in that story, the actual story itself could be set anywhere. Whereas the choice of story that I would have included, which is A Warning to the Curious, East Anglia as a region has a pivotal part to play in the plot. And so would have been a stronger choice for the opening story. It's integral to the plot. You couldn't have told that story anywhere else because it involves the ancient crowns of East Anglia. So I did ask him this, and his response is pretty simple. He said it was a tough call, but I think that A Whistle is the better crafted story, and I also like the idea of topping and tailing the anthology with a story from James's first collection, as well as his last published tale. Nice and simple, and again, yeah, I can see that. If you want to bookmark it, and again, as we were already discussing, again, the scope and the breadth of impact that James has had on horror writing, predominantly set in this area, I can understand why you want to do that. For me, I still say that A Warning to the Curious would have been the better choice. But I'm not the editor. That was obviously his call to make. As I've said a couple of times, thank you to Edward for taking the time and being gracious enough to respond to my questions. And if you do want to find out a bit more about him, as I said, check out his website. He did also say that he's currently working on another title for the British Library, which is fantastic, which should be out in the near future. And he's also working on a new narrative non-fiction book that should be out in 2027. So keep your eyes open for those. Before we wrap this up and come to the I ratings themselves, I know I haven't really kind of delved that much into the stories themselves, but that's because, I want you to read these and let the stories speak for themselves. But I will do as I normally do and give you my top three. I must admit, with the top three, I've not included Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, because its prestige speaks for itself already. A couple of honourable mentions, if you like, that are outside of that top three. The House on the Marsh, that's always a great one if you've never read it, by Frederick Cowles, which does also make me wonder if in some part it wasn't an influence on Susan Hill for The Woman in Black. And the other one that I was going to mention, again as an honourable mention, is a story that I was kind of eager to read, and that's Possum by Matthew Holness. Most people will probably know Matthew Holness by his alter ego, Garth Marenghi.
I love working with women. Well, hang on, let me rephrase that.
From Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. And I must admit, because the story Possum is written first person, you can't not hear it being read out in Garth Marenghi's voice, which completely juxtaposes with the bizarreness of the tale itself. The reason why I wanted to mention this one is because I'd seen the film adaptation of Possum a few years ago, and I didn't like it. Don't get me wrong, I'm a lover of slow burn movies, but there was something about this one that was about the film adaptation that felt quite abstract and quite self-indulgent at the same time, and I didn't like it. So I was interested to see if I'd have the same reaction to the story. Thankfully, no, I didn't. I think the story works better in print than the movie adaptation that we've had. Possibly I should go back and rewatch it now in light of having read the story. But as to my top 3 itself, and I'm quite pleased that 2 of these stories are by authors that I've never read before. The first one is from Penelope Fitzgerald and is called Dr. Matthews' Ghost Story. This is actually taken from a novel about Fitzgerald's creation, Dr. Matthews, who is very much a fictitious foil for M.R. James himself. And the story relates to Dr. Matthews discussing an event that happened to him in his youth, where he went on an archaeological dig in Cambridgeshire, I believe, in the Fens, and of something horrible that happened there. And it's curious as well that there is a heavy nod in the direction of A Warning to the Curious in how that story in here unfolds.
No digging here!
Which was really nice. And again, the creep factor is high, so it's a good one. My number 2, Misdemeanoring of Ascham by F.M. Mayer. Again, a lady who I don't know anything about. I'd never read any of her work before, but this one was fascinating. She has a wonderful talent for really capturing and conveying the sense of those long, soporific afternoons that we tend to get here in Norfolk or in East Anglia. The story itself features 2 young women who are here on holiday, and they're going out with their bikes, travelling around the Norfolk countryside in the hopes of finding something interesting. The tale, just having been one of those people who, whether travelling with my friend John, or whether by car or by bike as well, going off looking into the wilds of Norfolk to see if we can find some interesting ruins, things like this, it really struck a chord with me. Even more so because most of the setting and where the supernatural element of this stems from is the grounds of a dilapidated country estate that has its own chapel on it, which kind of got the hairs on the back of my neck rising after the incident that happened at Gunton Park. But my favourite one from this volume, and I must admit, even going into it, I kind of knew it was going to be. It's a very hard one to top, and it is one of the greatest ghost stories, I think, set in this area, and that is Ringing the Changes by Robert Aikman, which is just fantastic. This surrounds a couple, newlyweds. They're sort of a May to September couple, shall we say, who rush off last minute on a short holiday to the fictitious town of Hollyhaven on a particular night of the year, and surrounds what befalls them during their stay. I love this story so much that I did actually end up putting Aikman on the list as well to find some more of his work beyond what I already know, because they're eminently engaging, creepy to to the nth degree, and all wrapped up with this delicious black humour as well. So again, it was always going to be a hard one to top. So with that being said, do I recommend that you check out this volume? Yes, absolutely I do. I think it's a great example of ghost stories from this area. I think it's a great introduction to the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. So much so that once I finally at some point complete my collection of Pound Books of Horror, I'm giving serious consideration to making this my next anthology series, to gather and find room on a shelf for. Especially as I have now discovered that one of the volumes is specifically looking at the works of one of my other favourite authors, William Hope Hodgson. But yeah, do check it out. Again, whether your interest is in fantastical horror, or whether it's just in stories set in this region. Whatever your sphere of interest, it's worth checking out. Do give it a look. In terms of our I ratings, so a bit of a cheeky on this one, as you can see. So for the actual product itself, I've given it a 3i for that. As I said, I like it. I like the accompaniments to the actual text itself. The font is fine, it's perfectly legible. The extraneous stuff, the aesthetic stuff on it is really nice and appropriate to the subject matter. But, as I say, for a book that's 6 months old, it's already had a lot more wear and tear than I would normally expect. So it gets a 3i for that. Content, this is the nearest way that I can represent a 4.5. All of the stories are fantastic, well chosen, brilliant examples of work in this area. And I know it's slightly pernickety of me for it, but there are a couple of things that I did think, and again, as I've said, one of them being the choice of which stories to include for the volume itself, that just take it off the top spot. So, very well deserved 4.5 in terms of the content. We can now take this off the list as well. While I do that, I must admit, I just suddenly realised there was one of the other stories that I did mean to make an honourable mention of, and that is the story by Benson, The Dust Cloud, which features a haunted automobile. And what I really liked about that one, not so much that aspect of it, considering again you're looking at a story from the 1920s. I think what I liked more about it was Benson's commentary on 1920s road rage, which was interesting. Something I didn't expect to see, especially for something that wouldn't become such a social hot topic until the 90s. So, yeah, that was very well chosen. But anyway, so here we go. Eerie, East Anglia comes off the list. As I say, I can try and find some space on a shelf somewhere for it, and we can look at what we're going to be doing next. And this one is going to be a bit of a short change around between these episodes, as the next volume I'll be looking at is a veritable childhood favourite, and that is The Iron Man by Ted Hughes. It's been a long time since I've read this one, but as you can see, it's not going to take me long to get through it, so I shall be back sooner than normal. And that's it. So thank you again for, listening to me witter on for a while about books. One final thank you to Edward for responding to us. Normally, I would sign off with my usual thing of saying, get thee gone. And anyone who's been following what we do on the channel, this show in particular, will know I try and keep these things as non-partisan as possible. Unfortunately, certain things are happening in this country at the moment that can't be ignored. Specifically, things like the rather totalitarian online safety bill, which could come into effect. That being the case, and things associated with it, I find myself unable to be able to say to people to get thee gone, because it feels like we're rapidly approaching a period where you might find yourself getting yourself gone through no fault of your own, possibly into the back of a van in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. And I wouldn't want to wish that on anybody. So until such a time as our country comes to its senses and we can see the repeal of this, again, frankly, Orwellian law that is infringing on people's right to free speech, I'm going to change how I sign off these episodes. It's not an original one, I'm going to admit. It is a steal, but if I'm going to steal, I'm going to steal from the best. So, much like our current government, all I shall say is, be seeing you. Sorry, I'm still... Suckies.
Yes, you were going to say?
I was not going to say anything at all. You didn't hear that. It's all slander. I haven't even started yet.